Hello, everybody. My name is Peter Dorrington, and I'm going to be your moderator today. But firstly, let me welcome you to this webinar with SD Worx. Now, today joining me are two experts, first of which is Simon Parsons of SD Worx, and the second is Helen Bailey of Capital One. So let me get them to introduce themselves. So Simon, let me start with you. Would you mind just doing a brief introduction, please?
Yeah, sure. Good morning, everyone. It's good to be with you and this event today. I'm Simon Parsons, UK Director of Compliance for SD Worx. I've been with the business now for 25 years. My specialism is IT and payroll software development, and I'm a specialist in payroll solutions. I have the Master of Science from the Chartered Institute of Payroll Professionals diploma, also the chair of the BCS Payroll Specialist Group and an organisation called IRENE, which deals with electronic exchange with government. So my background is dealing with complex payroll law and how it's applied into software. And it's good to be with you today.
Great. Thank you very much, Simon. And Helen, would you mind doing the same? A quick introduction, please.
Hi, sure. Thank you. And thanks for inviting me. So yeah, I'd like to share with you a little bit about my story too, and hopefully provide some meaningful insight into how things work for us at Capital One. So I'm Helen Bailey. I've been at Capital One for 22 years, where I've built my career in risk management, compliance and internal audit. And then I moved to HR about 7 years ago. On joining HR, I set up the HR Business Risk Office, which involved establishing principles, practices, and frameworks for HR risk management. And that still remains in force today. But I now further manage our back office HR processing activities, which includes payroll, which I took over sort of leadership oversight of about a year ago. That's me.
Great. Thank you very much, Helen. Now, before we begin, I'm just going to go through a little bit of housekeeping. Now, because this is a webinar, you don't need to worry about being on camera or muting your microphone, but we do want to hear from you. So if you have questions at any time during our discussion, please do put them into chat, and I'll be monitoring that all the way through. So if you ask a question there, we'll bring it to the table and talk about it at the first convenient point. So by all means, put your questions in chat or make your observations, swap recipes or tell a joke. Now, the other thing that I'd like to do is say that this webinar is being recorded. So you will send instructions on how to access that after the webinar, but don't feel you have to make millions of notes. And you'll be pleased to hear that today is going to be all conversation and not death by PowerPoint. So there won't be lots and lots of slides, but lots and lots of conversation. Now, to kick us off, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Simon to set the scene for us. So Simon, if you wouldn't mind, I'd love to get a few words from you about why payroll compliance is such an important topic to be discussing now.
Yes, and yesterday may be an example of why. So we had the spring statement from Rishi Sunak yesterday, making further change to payroll and adding to the complexity. So many years ago, the operation of payroll was around calculating wages predominantly, obtaining sufficient cash from the banks in notes and coins and putting them in brown envelopes and making sure they were securely issued to the employees. Often the most serious risk in operation at that time was the wage heist. So whether someone would turn up in a couple of cars and steal the wages as they're arriving. But over the past few years, in fact, for some time, I'd say the past 20, the compliance obligations of payroll have increased rapidly with the introduction of a number of elements and obligations. And this is an area that we at SD Worx are looking at and interested in, because looking back at the legacy of us as an organisation from our origins as being part of one of the major banks in the UK through to being part of a compliance specialist that's around Europe, is that we've been active in the City of London, certainly around financial institutions, back in the days when they were centred around the city and then have moved out into the regions and locations of Britain, to think that we've got a great legacy on financial market and sector, because it has some unique aspects about it. For one, you've got to be careful with the staff you employ, and then the specialist arrangements being in the financial sector in relation to reward that make it maybe slightly different than the main payroll obligations that there are. And then we've got the HMRC, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, that have increasingly brought in compliance obligations on employers over the years with the introduction of real-time information. Then you've got the challenge in the financial market. I'm sure we'll explore some of these elements because, again, on recent news, we've got sanctions against Russia. So there's an element of what do we do about economic crime controls and obligations that fall on you as financial institutions, and where do you place your trust in ensuring that you're meeting your regulatory obligations as well. So the pace of change is ever increasing. Yesterday, we had the Chancellor announcing change to employment allowance that impacts more smaller employers. 6th of July, change to primary national insurance thresholds. And then in 2024, change to basic rate predictions. So remuneration and reward is becoming more complex, but equally also is the value of individual data. I'm sure that, like me, I imagine most of you have been receiving regular calls from certain major companies every day asking you for details that may actually be a scam. So there's an element of ensuring that we are secure, we handle data securely, and that we keep the integrity of our most important asset, which I'd suggest is probably our people, so that we reduce the risks and have an ability to go through. So where do we place that expertise trust to handle all these changing rules, because they're complex? You know, I have a Master of Science in the subject. I'm sat on a number of committees. We stay close to the changes as they occur. Can we all do that, or do we need to operate in trusted partnerships that can ensure that our risks are reduced and we have the compliance obligations continuing? Qualification is also the other area that I think is important, is that when we do place responsibility with those to assist us, that we know that they're qualified, verified is another angle as well. And something maybe we'll explore is occasionally we refer to it as single points of failure. I tend to like to call them single points of success, because they are usually a single point of success, but when they're out of the equation, leads to significant risk for organizations of where you keep the competency required to do what in effect is fairly complex obligations of an employer. How does that do? I think that takes us where I think we need to be for the introduction here, is to ensure that how are you supported in maintaining the compliance of your pay solutions for your staff and your organization.
Great. Thank you very much, Simon. Great introduction. And one of the things I've always noted about payroll is that so many people think it just happens. How complicated can it be? That we make sure that everybody gets paid the right amount on time in the right way. Surely it's something we can fully automate. Now we're going to do the first of our polls. So in a second, if you go to the menu, and that's under the three dots if it's hidden away at the moment, find polls, and we're going to start with this first poll. So the question is this: how confident are you that your current payroll practices are able to respond to changes in legislation? Now, it's a multiple choice, so obviously it may not be exactly what you have in mind, but go for the answer closest to your situation. So how confident are you that your current payroll practices are able to respond to changes in legislation? And the answers are: I have complete confidence, I'm fairly confident, but with some specific concerns, not very confident, unfortunately, or I don't know. So we'll let that run for a moment. And I do think that, so I'm just going to reflect on a moment that we saw yesterday, as Simon said, Rishi Sunak actually talking about making some changes. The government is always tinkering. And I think in the current economic environment we find ourselves, it's very volatile and uncertain. And of course, the government has got this massive tax gap it's trying to close, in that we've spent billions, if not trillions, that they want to get back and reduce the national debt, as well as he's obviously already thinking in a couple of years' time that we're going to be having an election. So I don't think we've seen the end of changes yet. And much vaunted tax simplification just doesn't seem to ever get there. Okay, so let's stop now and let's look at the results. So interestingly, 41% of you said, I have complete confidence that your current payroll practices are able to respond to changes in legislation. 46%, slightly more, fairly confident, but with some specific concerns. Only 7% said not very confident, unfortunately, and only 5% saying, I don't know. Now, if you wanted to elaborate a little bit on that in chat, please do. And as I say, please do feel free to ask questions in chat. We will come to them, and I'll try and leave a little bit of time at the end that we can deal with any specific questions. But Simon, let me come back to you to, firstly, let me just ask this. How have recent changes in legislation impacted payroll? What's it actually meant in practical terms?
Well, this is where it can increasingly become confusing between where the relationships happen, Peter. I think there's an element of what we traditionally think is part of payroll may actually stretch into other business process and practice. And often we may think there isn't a problem when in reality there is. And so it's identifying those cases. If I talk in generalistic terms, this may not apply always to the financial employment market, but it depends on what end it's operating and the types of operation that's going on. But holiday pay change into law is little understood, and I'd say most employers don't actually comply with the latest. I'm not saying that's specific to financial, I think that's a general. So there are obligations there that seem to be out of date. Lots of employers will consider that national minimum wage law doesn't really apply to them. They haven't got any risk until the auditors arrive. And then, and we've had, I'd say even there in the Deutsche Bank case in Spain, with the unpaid overtime hours monitoring consideration that came through the EU courts, that potentially had implication. Possibly not for the UK, because we've now left the EU jurisdiction, but there were potentials for accurate time recording requirements, and that case was specific to the financial market that could have affected the whole of the EU. And so, it's a large subject. We've had 2 years of about 50 changes with furlough and CJRS schemes, pandemic. It's ever changing is the picture, and sometimes we don't realize that, or maybe it makes us go a little bit fuzzy in the head and we tend to ignore it. I think increasingly, though, it's becoming important as the government bring in audit and single enforcers and regimes that potentially can cause reputational and financial damage to certain businesses. So it's just making it sure it's covered.
Great, thanks very much, Simon. Helen, I'd like to just bring you in, but before I do, I just wanted to reflect on one of the things in that poll. It was quite interesting that only 4 in 10 people say they have complete confidence that their payroll system is compliant. I know this, of course, is something that you're very interested in. So we might explore that again in a moment. But before we do, how have the recent changes in legislation impacted payroll in your experience?
Well, essentially, for us, we have to use our frameworks to help us ensure that we comply. So it's all about making sure you can identify those requirements and build controls around them. Clearly, we use SD Worx as a provider as well, right? So we do look to SD Worx to support us with these changes. And we also work really closely with our external counsel partners as well to make sure we understand and can interpret those changes and make process changes accordingly. I would say some of the changes that you expect to see, like tax changes, NIC changes are things that occur more frequently. We have processes that can adapt to that. I think things like the holiday pay change that you referred to, Simon, is a little bit more complex and takes a little bit more noodling through, and there are different ways of interpreting that. And so I would say that that kind of thing is more complex, which is why you have to have a structure around this stuff to at least be able to identify it in the first place and then be able to take the right action.
Great, thanks, Helen. Yeah, ambiguity, I absolutely hate it. I wish things were actually much more clear cut. But I guess when you're faced with a fast moving environment like this, where there are so many changes going on, you can't anticipate every possible scenario, every possible set of circumstances. So that being the case, Helen, let me come back to you then and ask this. So what are the key considerations around compliance and risk management and data security? What needs to be top of our mind when we're thinking about this?
Well, I guess the first thing I want to say is, like, compliance, data security and risk management are just table stakes for us. They are non-negotiables. And the way in which we structure our sort of frameworks is based upon that. For me, and I just touched on it, the biggest thing is having knowledge of your requirements or having a process to identify those and creating a level of structure around what you do in this space. And this isn't just for payroll, right? This can be any of the other processes that you manage, the connected pensions processes, for example. What are those legal and regulatory obligations and how are you going to identify them and make sure you comply? So, for example, a couple of those compliance frameworks we have in place at Capital One, we have a horizon scanning program. So we're continually monitoring sort of external websites, meeting with our external law partners, connecting with SD Worx on a regular basis to understand what the impending changes to law are. What we don't want to do is respond when they become a requirement, right? We want to get on the front foot of those. And so we continually monitor those. The other thing that we do is we actually write down every single one of our compliance obligations in a formal system of record. And we are required through our risk management policies to actually build controls to demonstrate how we're going to comply with those. And on a biannual basis, we actually refresh that list formally with our external law partners. And they sort of become the basis for then conversations with SD Worx, right? How are we going to partner together to build a suite of controls to ensure we comply with those things? Something someone always said to me, actually, it was in my internal audit days, was you can't outsource your compliance obligations. You have to own and be accountable for that yourself. So whilst, listening to what Simon was saying and all of SD Worx knowledge on these committees and these forums, we absolutely rely upon SD Worx to bring that information to us and help us through this stuff, but we have an obligation to test and monitor that. And so we build our frameworks around making sure that we can test that those things are occurring as they should be. I just wanted to touch on the data security thing a little bit, if I may. Within Capital One, we have a pretty large framework around this. We have very clear standards and policies around sort of data security expectations. And, again, we have to monitor adherence to those with our third parties. And so we have pretty intense and in-depth conversations with SD Worx to sort of test that those things are being adhered to. So for me, I'm not an expert in data security, right? And I'm not an expert in, detailed payroll legislation. But what I do is create a structure that allows me to lean on those experts and gather that insight from the right people to allow us to put in place sort of proportionate risk management practices and controls to make sure that we can sort of assure compliance moving forward.
Great. Thank you very much, Helen. Yeah, data security, really, I think, even more important now than at any other time with so much going on. But Simon, let me come to you and ask you the same question then. You deal with lots of organizations who are working their way through this with SD Worx. What are some of the key considerations you're hearing about compliance, risk management, and data security?
You're quite right, Peter. So there are, especially in the industry, there are regulatory conditions that you'll need, and banking level type considerations in relation to payments, etc. So this is where, with our partnering with our clients, we'll undertake various industry standard type obligations through. You have things like ISO 27701, accredited information security, which enables an organization to demonstrate how it is dealing with its security. Then you've got things like ISA 3000 Type 1 certification, which I think Helen's already mentioned about having controls and tests of those controls to see that they're fit and proper. And then that goes into ISA 3402 SOC 1 type accreditations as well, where you're actually doing that to a level of proving to other organizations of audit. So these elements of trust, and I think it gets into an area of trust and ethos of having means of reducing risk and monitoring it and understanding where the challenges are, becomes critical, I would have thought, to most organizations, especially in the financial sector, because you've got to, in effect, be able to demonstrate that your own regulators that you're taking that serious consideration. And increasingly, personal information becomes critical. I think there is a lot of misunderstanding on obligations. For example, we'll have people come and tell us that under GDPR, certain records have to be destroyed after a period of time or when they left. I think there's an element of understanding what the GDPR actually says, because a lot of data is required for lawful purpose, and you don't want to destroy it before that lawful purpose is fulfilled. So that's pensions obligations, health and safety, tax, income tax requirements on retention, etc. We actually had a few years back an DO request from an individual who challenged as to why their data had been shared with HMRC without permission, without their express permission, and the response was it was a legal requirement. The employer would have no choice. They're actually obliged. Does that breach GDPR? Absolutely it doesn't, because GDPR would require the compliance with legal requirements to share relevant data. The challenge with GDPR, for example, is not sharing it when it's not required or for a purpose. So it's understanding what the obligations are about our compliance sometimes. Hopefully that's a little bit helpful, but these are important in a partnership arrangements to agree what the needs and means are. It was interesting also that Helen mentioned about whose obligation is it to fulfill compliance elements. The obligation really sits with the business, the employer. It can't be outsourced. You can outsource an element of doing the compliance aspect, but ultimately if it ended up in courts, they wouldn't be taking your supplier to court, they'd be taking you. And so it's just understanding of where the responsibilities are. And another area, if I just cover it, for example, national minimum wage breach, I'm sure that won't apply in all financial institutions generally, but can, because there's an element of how much time is actually measured, is pay sufficient to cover. It's criminal activity. There's an element of could you offload criminal activity responsibility to a third party? Well, you can get the third party to help, but you can't offload the criminal activity. They just wouldn't take it, and the courts wouldn't either. So there is an element of making sure things are in order and a suitable means to ensure that your risks are covered and regulated. And I think that's where these partnership arrangements with customers such as Capital One, in ensuring that the appropriate certifications apply that meet the tests to cover what you need to assure people like the FCA or other regulatory bodies that you're being appropriate are in place.
If I may, Simon, I've just got a couple of things I'd just like to respond to on that. GDPR is an interesting one, right? Because we have our own obligations to adhere to GDPR requirements, but so do you. Whereas there are some cases where we are almost employing you to perform a compliance process on our behalf. And even just understanding that is helpful to realize that, you know, you are bound by GDPR in the same way we are, and we get a level of assurance from that. There are other areas where we perhaps have to go and do additional testing to allow us to fulfill on our obligations. So I thought that was important to mention. And then the other thing that just struck me, maybe not necessarily in the context of this, but when you mentioned around national minimum wage and, financial services maybe not, struggling to meet that. I think in principle, yes, but by the time you take some of those salary sacrifice things and these other benefits we offer, again, you then introduce another layer of complexity. And when you take a long, hard look at your compliance obligations, really understanding what that means and how it plays out in practice, which is what you were saying at the beginning, Peter, is absolutely critical. Because often, a few simple words of a requirement are hiding a multitude of expectations that you really do need to understand. And I think just the final thing I'm interested in, Simon, is how does Capital One compare to some of your other organizations that you partner and provide services for, in terms of this requests for assurance, providing some information on some of these controls? Do we fare comparably, or do you perceive us to have higher expectations?
I think you have fairly high expectations, Helen, but why wouldn't you? So there's an element of why not? Do others have less expectations? I think sometimes they do, and maybe they should think a little bit more. So there's a third that care, a third that don't care, and a third that muddle along in the middle, I think, is the reality of it. And also, you're mentioning some circumstances there, that sometimes there can be an assumption that because we're a financial institution, we don't have any problem with certain areas of compliance responsibility that fall on the ordinary OIC, if I call them that, or a retailer or a factory. However, you've still got people that go on maternity leave. You've still got people that go on long-term sickness. There's still got, as you're saying, complex salary sacrifice arrangements, or they may, quite often what we see in some financial institutions is entire salary sacrifice in the last couple of months up to retirement, whereas actually you have just breached national minimum wage law. Yeah. But we think we haven't, and it's understanding how it overlays, and just crossing the I's and dotting the T's is sort of the backward way of expressing that, isn't it? Yeah. Sometimes it is almost doing the opposite of what you think you should do, yeah, just to make sure.
Yeah, and I also think just, something to share that I've learned along the way is monitoring case law too, right? Seeing how cases play out, because they're also a test of the law and can help you as you seek to, work out what you are going to do around this stuff. Understanding what's happened and how, the courts have seen this stuff play out is really, really helpful. And for us, it was that helped us get our arms around the holiday pay uplift. So that was one of those little known things that was a little bit hidden, and actually it was a review of case law that allowed us to go, actually, we have a vulnerability here and we need to do something about it. So that's also useful to monitor.
If I may, these days we can buy anything on the web, almost, it feels like. There's some great gadgets, and occasionally I've probably even bought some because I thought they were great and the price was great. And sometimes we can be wowed by tech. The problem is when I plugged it in, it melted. And there's an element of what seems good tech isn't necessarily good for what we're using it for. And I think that can happen even with payroll. HR services is an element of thinking. There does need to be an element of looking at other aspects rather than just functionality alone, because I imagine, Helen, you're looking for things like financially sound organization rather than it's a couple of fellas in a garage that have come up with some great tech. Is it a true partnership? That sort of area. And then you go into other areas, because occasionally disasters happen. So you've got exploding oil refinery that knocks out office blocks nearby. What happens if a disaster happens in a facility operated by a trusted partner? So I imagine you're probably looking at where's contingency, what's disaster recovery, all other aspects as well, other than thinking, well, I can pay them £5 and they'll calculate a payslip for me alone. There's an element of what would happen if your people weren't paid.
Yeah, and I think, I think we're going to come on to that a little bit later as well, as we think about, what kind of payroll provider, would you want to partner with? We definitely come on to that. But the things you're talking to me are just classic, talking about just then were just classic risk management stuff, right? Know your risks, understand them, and ensure you build adequate controls to monitor and mitigate them. So all of those things that you said are true. But for me, you have to have a level of structure that allows you to capture and do something meaningful. Knowing something is one thing. It doesn't help you if you don't take action. So just being clear on what those issues are and being able to take action is like the best advice I could give.
Great, thanks very much, Helen. So a couple of points there I'd just like to reflect on. One, the word trust came up several times there. And I think that when you dig into what do we mean by trust, often for many people it means that there's an expectation which is set by organizations and legislators and so on. So that's a commonly agreed standard or a deliverable that we all want. But then there's the delivering it pragmatically but consistently. So you're doing it in a legal way and that we know we can rely on it. So one of the things about trust is, I say, it operates even beyond the realms of where we are right now. But the other word I'd like to dig into a little bit more, and Helen, let's do this now. We've already introduced this idea of a partner. So when we're working with partners, you've already said you can't outsource your compliance obligations, and I absolutely understand that. But how could we hold third-party providers to the same standards and controls that we expect of ourselves and our industry? So how can we actually measure the performance and hold them accountable for those standards and controls?
Yeah, I mean, it's important that we do, right? And we need to know that they're meeting their obligations and we're meeting our obligations. And I'll say the same thing again. We need a level of structure and control around that. For me, it starts with the onboarding of our third parties. So we have good third party arrangements and contracts set up. So clear expectations set in the contract around what you expect around compliance or risk management or contingency. What are those stipulations that you are going to put up front? So for me, the onboarding is a critical part of being able to hold a third party to account. Within that contract, we also require what we refer to as audit requirements. So not only do we expect you to do this thing, we expect you to allow us to come and check you're doing that thing. So if you set it up front, it becomes much easier to lean on contractual arrangements, and hold your third parties to account through that route. So that's the start point. And it won't surprise you, right, that we also have a large third-party management policy and program that is designed to help our vendor managers manage our third parties in line with the risk that they present to our organization. So particularly, for example, when we're sharing data, the requirements around how you manage and monitor that are increased, unsurprisingly. And, we have so many things that we look at in and around that. Simon touched on a few, but what are your contingency arrangements? What are the key risks that are presented through this arrangement? And then the other thing that I wanted to call out is, I'm talking here a lot around, third-party management and the principles of doing the right thing. I also need to make sure my payroll is being processed okay. And, ensuring that we're working with highly skilled people, right, who know their stuff. As I say, Simon is hugely skilled in payroll legislation, and ensuring that information is imparted and embedded and inherent within the way in which SD Worx process our payroll, for example, is absolutely critical. So yeah, upfront contracting, clear ongoing monitoring frameworks in place, and yeah, maintaining healthy, effective relationships with our suppliers, that also helps, right? You can start to say, where are you coming from? Where are we coming from? How do we come together to solve this thing is hugely critical. And clear roles and responsibilities. You know, we touched on this earlier. Who does what, when, and whose responsibility is it? And I think if you can get to that, you know, you are a significant, you know, part of the way there. So yeah, that for me is, you know, you have to set the arrangement up properly and you have to have adequate monitoring frameworks in place. And to do that, you need to know what it is you want of this provider. So understanding that has to come first.
Great, thanks, Helen. And I'm actually going to change this slightly different to for Simon. I'm going to ask the same thing, but instead of the word provider, I think that you would look at this, and I think Helen would probably agree, as being a partner. So, you know, how do you see yourself being you know, held to those same standards and controls that your customers demand as a partner? So reflecting the requirements they have, the expectations they have, and the openness. We'll come to actually what does that look like in practice in just a moment. But I'd love to hear your thoughts about that. As a partner to Capital One, what does it mean to you?
Yeah, well, the critical aspect of the role I have is in the partnership aspect of thinking, how do we ensure compliance? Sometimes we can have a relationship which is a customer provider, thinking we're there to fulfill the customer's needs alone. And that's true. We are there to fulfill them, but to an extent, because when we fall into payroll tax type handling, there are obligations to another stakeholder, which is Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs and the government. So there's an element of, if a customer came to us and said they want to break law, we'd probably have to have a serious conversation about why and what that's for. Now, there could be a view that actually we're not giving good customer service by pointing that out, but we would take a view that we are giving good customer service because we're pointing out the compliance risks associated with that. Plus, we do have obligations to other parties. So there's an element of, and even as financial institutions, you have obligations because you'll have to be AML supervised for FCA or other organisations, etc. So there are legal obligations that fall on you that we need to be aware of. So, and that's my specialism. So if I talk about how do I deal with that on the changes of law yesterday, the speech would have been heard, the detail would have been out. We were actually already been involved in some confidential consultation prior in the week. Don't necessarily always know the detail. We just know hints and discussions of impacts. To actually have that assessed, which was done yesterday, and the projects initiated yesterday in time. For a lot, there's an element of thinking that could have taken a couple of weeks more before it actually came out and was progressed. So there's an element of being on the ball and getting it whilst you can. But I think that's kind of saying in a payroll market, there are three stakeholder types groups. There's ourselves, our client, and there's the obligations to government, and which is important there. That sometimes means having an uncomfortable conversation with some customers at times. Does that help? But I think it's there. It's sort of a protection to say, do we understand the implications of this? But ultimately, we're there to serve our customers in their need, but to keep them clean. I don't know if that becomes clear or understandable at times. Equally, that goes on with other aspects of understanding in the relationships of what we can take on as responsibility and what we legally can't, because there are some things that we can't, even though it may seem like the clinch of a deal. So it's understanding how that really works. So as Helen talks about contract arrangements and negotiations in that, and getting that solid so that we're open and honest in what is really a partnership. So I'll say it's not a master-slave relationship at times, where it can I guess you're paying the money for the service, but actually it's a partnership to deliver success for businesses. And we believe we're a great partner for that.
Just on that HMRC thing, Simon, I was just reflecting on something I've been looking at recently. So, you know, SD Worx, Capital One pays SD Worx, right, to understand tax, HMRC, and national insurance. Like that's a skill we don't have. We're a credit card provider. That's why we're seeking that skill out. And it's a real difficult balance between not being able to outsource compliance, but actually buying a service in that has the skills to ensure we comply. And so actually our role, whilst we can't outsource, you know, our responsibilities, my role more becomes, can I just check that you have adequate arrangements to ensure that that works? As opposed to, let me go and repeat what you've done to check you've done it correctly, right? Because I haven't got those skills, which is why I pay you to do it in the first place. So that's just an interesting thing to, you know, for maybe the folks on this call to explore, is where are your providers giving you a service because you don't have the skills to do it? And so you may not need to repeat that in order to check it's being done correctly. But how and through what mechanism will you get the assurance that, you know, the provider is doing the right thing? And that's something I've been trying to explore more recently, because I think it's one of those less obvious ones. You know, we need to provide, you know, pay the required income tax, but I don't know how to calculate it, right? That's your specialism. So just navigating that has been quite interesting.
Great, thanks very much, Helen. We've actually had a question just touched on, you mentioned incorrect income tax. It's just come in, it's from Emma, and she said, what would you suggest to do if HMRC have issued an incorrect tax code which detriments a member of staff by applying it? So HMRC have acknowledged the incorrect code, but have not issued a correct one. And I feel I'm not providing a good service by sitting back and doing nothing. So there's an interesting real world case there. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that. And Simon, let's go to you first. What would you suggest? And then perhaps, Hannah, you could share your thoughts about how you might deal with that.
I actually had this myself in the last couple of months. So I'm certainly happy when Simon's said his bit to pass my view.
Yes, and there are a couple of options, because legally the application of tax codes is HMRC's, so they have that power and authority, as it were. So the only time that an employer actually makes a decision on tax codes is on new starter, where they don't provide a P45. That's the only time, and then it's depending on the declaration made. So what do you do? Well, there is a mechanism that I handle on this, is because if you operate something different and HMRC don't agree with you, they'll do what they call a determination 80, which means they'll transfer the liability from the individual to the business, which you don't necessarily want to happen, because they'll say you've not operated a legal instruction. However, there is a means of handling it. If you believe the HMRC have issued the wrong one and you have some sort of verbal confirmation of that, is you tell them. So in some form or other, whether they open that letter or not, you've got an auditable trail that you've actually communicated what you did to them, so gave them the opportunity. And it's, I'd say that's a little bit of a halfway house activity, because there probably isn't a legal basis for really doing that, but it's a defense against the determination 80 notification, because you did let them know that's what you do. And I've had an instance even yesterday, we're running very close to the year end and tax codes are not being issued by HMRC, where the email from CDIO, that's Chief Digital Information Officers of HMRC, have issued on the email that that's an authorization to make the change. So it can't come through the physical means, because that's impossible at the moment, but they have come up with an alternate. I think it's always good to have an audit trail of whatever you do and a basis of why. But don't just do it with nothing, because you'll open yourselves up to all sorts of things.
Great, thanks, Simon. So, Helen, you said that this is something that happened for you a little while ago, so I'd love to just briefly hear your experience.
So just a bit of context to the story then. We have multiple employing entities within our UK business, and we were transferring some employees from one entity to another. And the information was presented to HMRC as part of the normal payroll run. And it looked like they'd got two employers. And so HMRC did a sort of mass change of tax codes for this group. I'm not going to profess to understand why, but they changed tax codes. What actually happened was that the group of people ended up being paid more, actually, which was helpful. Although we then had to go through a process to try and claw that back. What we did was we sought to understand why, right? What's going off and why is it going off? And we engaged with HMRC to understand that. And once we got comfortable on why it was happening and why it was presenting as it was, SD Worx were able to manually change the tax codes back to what they were before this change had taken place. What that highlighted to me, though, is that there is a process to fall out of automation and go into manual. So now I'm seeking to go, what controls do you have around that manual process for changing tax codes, right? So I'm now asking those questions, which I wouldn't have otherwise done, but we have built a process that allows us to do that. And actually, whilst I would have never have thought we'd have needed to have done, here we are needing to leverage that process. What we actually discovered was that HMRC had said, you know, we're going to continue to produce the wrong tax codes for you for a period of time until we catch up with you. But rest assured, we will catch up with you, and you tell your employees that we will, and not to call us, because we're, you know, anything that we issue to them, we acknowledge at this point is incorrect because we have to catch up. I can honestly say the biggest piece of advice I could give is communicating with your employees on what's happening and why. You know, we even to the point where the problem was fixed, and we then went out and said, just to let you know, it won't happen again for a further 2 months, because, you know, whilst they didn't know it wasn't going to happen again, they were sat there waiting for their pay slips to land, and it was driving multiple questions. So I think for me, it's understanding the why, and then working out if you have any processes that allow you to make, you know, correct change on a formal basis, right? And then make sure you communicate with your employees and come up with a plan.
Great, thanks very much both. Took that question because it was actually pertinent at the time. So many and mysterious are the ways of HMRC, and when you do get those exceptional cases, that's when you highlight where you do need perhaps some additional support around those. Now, Simon, I'm going to come back to you. I do beg your pardon. So what does a best of breed payroll system look like for financial services? So how would you define that? What's the best of breed? What's the best we can expect?
Best of breed, we've probably covered a number of the aspects in the conversation we've had today, but let's recap on some of them. I think best of breed, are they financially sound, or are they going to disappear next week? You're trusting a lot of personal information to them. So do they have appropriate process and accreditations in place to handle that? Is it a true partnership arrangement? So do they act as a partner to you? And looking at their systems and also the credibility and professionalism of the qualifications of their staff. Are they actually at an appropriate level? We see things very differently if we went into a hospital or into treatment for medical needs, to think that you want appropriate professionals, but it's strange. But for some things, even in life, probably go and seek potential advice on important decisions at the pub. But there's a question: is the pub advice actually appropriate? Sometimes it might be, but are they qualified and do they know what they're saying? So I think there is an element of best of breed, looks on stability, history, and also their adaptation of new technology as well. So that it's a journey for the future and how responsive they can be. Unfortunately, payroll is becoming increasingly complex, and there are odd situations. And I think Helen's just highlighting the challenges sometimes of even the HMRC systems and how they catch up with what was former business practice, because still there are 2 million inadvertent duplications created a year on the systems, which then have to go through a merge process, which cause all this sort of tax code for us at times. So then you're looking at needed when you know, what is the risk So credibility and the risk associated, because you don't want to fall foul, and an organisation that keeps abreast of government and employment change that applies to you as a client. I think they're all important in relation to what best of breed looks for financial service industry. Plus, you do have regulatory obligations, so you want the assurance that you can confirm to your regulator that you're meeting some of these aspects that they require. Banking industry standards, maybe.
Great, thanks very much, Simon. Let me just ask the same question of you, Helen. So what for you is best of breed?
Yeah, I think we've covered a lot of this stuff, but building on what Simon's just said and back to what we were talking about at the beginning is the ability to adapt to change. I mean, the one thing we do know is that change is constant, and, you know, building systems and processes and relationships that can respond to that is critical. And to do that, you need a level of structure. And I touched on those things at the beginning. So I think absolutely the ability to adapt to change. True experts in their field, you know, we've touched on this a lot. You know, Simon is a payroll legislation expert. Why wouldn't I use him and his services as part of that relationship? So I think, you know, true deep subject matter expertise. Trusted partner, you know, we've covered what that means for us. That is around, you know, helping us manage our risk exposure. Our regulators expect us to do so. You know, payroll's a process that involves transferring money and involves personal data. You know, it's important that that is effectively managed and controlled. And so a partner that is willing to engage with you on that stuff and build adequate controls is key. And then something else I was just thinking around is just a keenness to develop and grow and evolve, right? The world around us is changing, and, you know, providers that are continually, you know, scanning the external environment and picking up on new ways of doing things, you know, evolving themselves and their processes and their skills is something that I would look for a provider to give for us.
Great, thanks, Helen. Now, we're going to have the second of our polls right now. So, and it's because I think this is a great point to do it. So the question is this. If you were looking to enhance your ability to remain compliant, where would you start? So answers are outsourcing payroll to a third party, payroll software with inherent compliance, building your own internal expertise, or don't know. So if you're looking to enhance your ability to remain compliant, where would you start? Outsource, payroll software with compliance built in, building your own internal expertise, or don't know. And whilst we gather the answer to that, let me just come back then to one final point. And I have got an eye on the clock. I did promise I'd get everybody away on time. There are a couple of words that I hear all the time in almost every walk of business, and those words are agility and resilience. So as people look forward, they're looking for solutions which are agile to change and resilient to things that are going on, so they're stable. So how can we ensure that a stable HR and payroll setup whilst remaining agile? So, so things like legislative change. So Simon, let me come to you first. How do we ensure we have a stable HR and payroll setup whilst we're remaining agile to deal with those unexpected changes?
Well, I think an aspect of this comes back a little bit to Helen's comment in relation to appropriate controls. So if you're using correct methodology and a process that works to establish that the risk is not increased, so you have an eye to continued compliance along that journey. So there's an element of being prepared to embrace new technologies, yet not increase the risks of instability and security. I think there's great benefit in simplification actually through technology that can be obtained. However, the wary side to that is not just rushing at the nice gadget that will melt when you plug it in, but ensuring that it meets the appropriate certification, that it doesn't melt, has been tested, has been assured, but does offer you the extra widgets and gadgets that we think will assist us in the future, and definitely will assist us in the future as well. There is also an element of fads. Sometimes are short-lived, so it's looking at actually the reality of its longevity and usefulness rather than just being a fad as well.
Great, thanks very much, Simon. Helen, your last word on this, I think. How do you ensure you get a stable HR and payroll set up whilst you remain agile to those future changes?
So I was just reflecting on this. It depends on your interpretation of the word stable, but I would argue that you only have a stable HR practice if it's able to respond to change. Because if you don't comply, it's unstable in my mind. So I think the two come hand in hand. We've talked about this. It requires structure, understanding your risk, and ensuring you build adequate controls.
Great, thanks very much. So the results are in. So the question was, if you're looking to enhance your ability to remain compliant, where would you start? 22% of the people said outsourcing payroll to a third party. About a third said payroll software with inherent compliance. 41% said building out their own internal expertise, and 3% said, I don't know. So, Simon, I'm just going to come to you then for the final word on this. Interesting results. Is that what you expected to see?
Yes, I think so. And I guess there's an element of seeing where the trends are. Traditional payroll is seen as maybe in-house, but what does that mean these days? Because a lot is delivered via cloud, so it's not in-house generally, and so there is always some sort of outsourcing involved with it. Sometimes I think there is a tendency to try to want to understand and control it all internally. I think that depends on the size of organization. So for the large organizations, that's possibly something that we coped with. For the smaller ones, I'm not sure how that skill is built up or focused on when actually it's a smaller institute. So it's a bit hybrid, isn't it? So I'll go back to my earlier sort of comment, is I think it comes in thirds, that some that will, some that won't, and some that don't really know or care. To be honest, I think it all goes along that line. So you will always get a little bit of that mixture. The important thing is knowing that we have options to choose, because all of them may work for our own personal circumstance, but it's worth exploring what all the options are, because we may actually find that there's an element of thinking 2 or 3 years ago, we'd have, or maybe longer, who'd have thought we'd be watching films on Wi-Fi? We'd go and buy a DVD. Who buys a DVD these days? And it's that sort of transition, isn't it, of thinking that's the same with other things and business processes, of thinking actually new technology changes the whole picture of how we do things.
Great, thank you very much, Simon. Yes, I think the only constant is change, but what isn't constant is the pace of change, which definitely feels like it's accelerating. So that ability to, work with a partner who can give you that inherent agility as well as the resilience, the reliability, the trust, incredibly important. So then, next steps. Well, what we're going to do is, firstly, we'll send you a follow-up on how you can watch this video on demand, so you can go back over it, pick up some of the key points as well. But we're also going to give you an opportunity to carry on the conversation one-to-one with SD Worx. So look out for that, because as we've seen, we've got some great expertise here. I tend to look at it as a way of getting a little bit of free consulting from some of the best brains in the business. But with that, all that really remains for me to do is firstly thank those best brains in the business. So thank you, Simon. Thank you, Helen. Incredibly insightful contributions. Who knew payroll was going to be so complicated? Well, I guess you did. And I also want to thank SD Worx, who sponsored this and made it possible to happen, as did the Executive Leaders Network for organising it. But most of all, I want to thank all of you for your attention. And until the next time, thanks very much. Take care and goodbye now. Cheerio. Bye-bye.
Bye.